Good morning. I'm harleysch from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for March 14th, 2024. I want to begin by reminding you what is the purpose of these updates. It's not to provide you with so-called information, but to give you the intelligence needed to take on the enemies of humanity, to become a citizen of a republic, of a sovereign nation, fighting for the benefit of all. I think you'll get this sense if you listen to the interview I did with Helga Zepp-LaRouche yesterday, where she said that people should take into their hearts the danger of nuclear war, then get up and act. The danger of nuclear war is real. The enemies of humanity are evil creatures who control governments and have an enormous amount of power through the media to corrupt a population and turn them into passive victims. You cannot accept that. In fact, if you look at the world, you'll realize that the establishment, which is responsible for this attempted brainwashing of the population, is undergoing an extreme case of panic and jitters over the crisis and the depth of the crisis that they've created. Let's just start with the failure in Ukraine. What's recognized now is that Ukraine cannot win. They have a shortage of ammunition. They have shortages of forces. And yet, what did Biden say at the State of the Union address? The pathetic captive of the globalist establishment in his attempt to rally the troops. And by the way, I hate to say this, but many Republicans were joining with the Democrats in cheerleading the war policy of Biden. What he said is, quote, "Ukraine can stop Putin if we stand with Ukraine and provide the weapons it needs to defend itself. That is all Ukraine is asking," unquote. Well, is Biden just hopelessly delusional, or is he a psychotic war hawk? Well, it doesn't really matter. Too many people in the Congress cheer that on, and too many others say there's nothing you can do about that. Now, then let's take a look at what's happening in other countries. In Germany, the German Air Force is discussing how to deploy Germany's long-range Taurus missiles to Ukraine without exposing the fact that German technicians are operating them to make sure they're properly targeted and effective. Then you have the coalition foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, talking about trading Taurus missiles to the United Kingdom, and then the United Kingdom sending more Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine, which can target Russia. Then you have Merz, the head of the CDU, the supposed opposition, openly calling for the deployment of Taurus missiles into Ukraine. Don't they realize that they're crossing a line by doing this? Then you have Macron, who in his machismo called for not ruling out NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine. Now, a French weekly magazine, Marianne, did an effective job of refuting what Macron said and pointing to the reasons why he said this. They reported on 3 defense intelligence memos which explain Macron's macho flight forward. First, the counteroffensive failed, obliterating 1/2 of Ukraine's 12 combat brigades. Secondly, a memo points to consistent errors in judgment. For example, the idea that the Russian economy would collapse under the weight of sanctions, that Russia's military was weak and poorly led, and third, that Western technology will prevail over the Russian military, all of which the defense intelligence sources indicate were completely misguided assumptions. And third, the intelligence reports say that Ukraine cannot win even with French troops, saying that French troops up against the Russians, we are an army of cheerleaders, unquote. Now, this is the kind of discussion that's going on behind closed doors among the establishment. Now, in reaction to this, Putin gave an interview with RIA Novosti, where he laid out the actual nature of the fight. And he declared that 500 years of European colonialism is over, that underlying all the discussion of what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in Gaza, it's the end of an imperial order that stretched over half a millennia. What Putin said is, quote, Western elites spent centuries filling their bellies with human flesh and their pockets with money. He went on to say that they now realize that the vampire ball is ending. Now, he said, as a result of this, we either face the danger of nuclear war if the West is going to continue to escalate, or we can resume the negotiating process and end the conflict. Now, it's clear Biden and the Western puppet governments are trapped as the military-industrial financial complex and the corporate cartel vampires which control them won't accept the fact that the vampire ball is over. Now, an example of this is what's going on in Gaza and the necessity to stop the offensive before there's mass slaughter in Rafah. There's already been mass slaughter. Over 30,000 Palestinians have been killed, the vast majority of them civilians, and nearly half of them children. Now, the reality here is that Israel is a golem, which was created by the British sponsorship of Zionism to carry out a geopolitical task, which is constant destabilization, so that, as in the case of overall geopolitics, what's necessary is the superpowers have to come in to sort out the mess when smaller nations are engaged in these kinds of regional wars. That's been what we've seen for the last 30 years. That's what the reality is behind Afghanistan, behind Syria, behind Libya, behind Ukraine. The attempt by the superpowers to maintain their status by creating these regional wars, these splendid little wars, as the British used to call them. And that's what Netanyahu's government is tasked to do. Now, listen to what Netanyahu had to say, because Netanyahu is the perfect figurehead for this Frankenstein monster. He spoke at the American-Israel Political Action Committee yesterday. What he said is that it's wrong to question in Washington what Israel is doing. There's no option, no other option but total victory, wiping out every last remnant of Hamas, even though his intelligence told him it's an objective which is an impossibility. But he said, no amount of pressure on Israel, quote, will stop us. And he demanded that the audience toe the line 100%. He said, quote, you cannot say you support Israel's right to exist and to defend itself, and then oppose Israel when it exercises that right. In other words, Israel has the right to do whatever it wants, and no one should question it. He then went on to say, you cannot say you support Israel's goal of destroying Hamas, and then impose Israel when it takes the actions necessary to achieve that goal, unquote. And the unspoken further statement is anyone who does so, who challenges Israel, is an anti-Semite. Now, that's the fallback option of the war hawks when it comes to the situation in the Middle East. So here's the question I posed at the beginning. Will citizens in the West remain passive victims or complaining cynics when the lying narratives are crafted by psychological warfare experts of NATO to make you passive or cynical? Now, one line from the French military intelligence report exposes the fraud of the narrative on the case of Ukraine, that Ukraine can win. And it points to the fact that reality is the alternative to these narratives. The intelligence report said, quote, the West can provide 3D printers to manufacture drones or loitering munitions, but will never be able to print men, unquote. That's the reality of the situation. The war is unwinnable, and yet to continue it threatens an escalation to the possibility of a nuclear World War III. And narratives can be broken by courageous people speaking the truth, and especially using the ironies and the hypocrisy to expose the fraud of the narrative itself. I would encourage you, take 30 minutes to listen to the dialogue discussion I had with Helga Zepp-LaRouche yesterday, which will be linked below. And while you're using these links, register for our Oasis conference on April 13th, which will discuss the alternative to permanent war, namely economic development for mutual benefit as the basis for peace. Now, I want to close with the words of a former United Kingdom ambassador, Craig Murray, who was commenting on this question of the panic of the ruling class in an op-ed that he posted on March 12th. He was talking about the case of George Galloway running in a by-election for the British Parliament and astounding all the pundits by a significant victory, putting himself in the Parliament, causing the pathetic Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Sunak, to launch an unhinged attack against him. What Murray said is that the Prime Minister denounced Galloway's election, quote, as an assault on British values and even on democracy itself. So Murray points out the idea that democracy, that is voting for somebody, is an attack on democracy was so crazy that if we had any kind of independent media, it would have been ridiculed to death. What we're told is that ordinary forms of democratic activity, free assembly, free speech, free voting, all threaten our society. Now, whose society do they threaten? Well, he says the political class are now in a panic, and they're lashing out everywhere. And he says, anyone currently not being branded as an extremist ought to be deeply ashamed. And he said, in the official view, only active supporters of genocide are not extremists. There is an irony for you that gets right to the heart of the problem. And he concluded his statement by saying, our hearts and minds remain with the people of Gaza. Their suffering and their heroism not only shines in itself, but it has cast a much-needed light on the complete failure of the model of Western democracy, unquote. You'll find a link to Murray's comments at the bottom of the description page. Now, tomorrow's Friday, so I'll be taking your questions and comments. Seriously, get off your rear end. If you have questions, if you have complaints, if you have criticisms, or if you have ideas on how to spread this movement, send them to me, and we'll take that up tomorrow. So thanks for joining me today, and I will be back here again tomorrow.